Welcome back to the channel. The United States, a vast modern country, but beneath the surface there are still dark and cold corners. Behind the thick walls of maximum security prisons, there are people who have paid the ultimate price for their terrible crimes, the death penalty. In today's video, we'll look at 5 cases that shocked America, brutal murders that shocked the public and left society in disbelief. We'll look at the crimes that landed them on death row before their executions. Before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're watching from.
April 23, 2025. In the chilling silence of the Huntsville Unit Prison, the soft but haunting sound of a needle-piercing skin marked the end of Moises Mendoza's life, the killer who once shook Farmersville to its core. At 41 years old, Mendoza faced execution by lethal injection, a common but controversial form of capital punishment in the U.S. Today, we will retrace his final journey, from a last meal that evoked the taste of home to his dying words. What transformed a once promising young man into one of the most violent individuals Collin County had ever seen? The story revolves around a single victim, yet her tragedy was enough to stun the entire Farmersville community. Rachelle O'Neal Tollison, a young mother just 20 years old, born on January 20, 1984, Rachelle was a resilient woman striving to navigate the challenges of divorce while caring for her 6-month-old daughter, Avery. Living alone in a small house in Farmersville, Texas, Rachelle was remembered by family and friends as a devoted mother who poured all her love into her child. Simple moments with Avery, from lullabies to dreams of a stable future, were her greatest joys. But on March 18, 2004, Rachelle's life was brutally extinguished. That morning, her mother came to visit and discovered a horrifying scene. Little Avery left alone and Rachelle gone. The back door of the house stood wide open, as if the intruder had brazenly walked in. In the bedroom, everything was in disarray. The mattress askew, the headboard damaged, furniture scattered, and papers and personal belongings strewn across the floor. This was no mere disappearance. It was the sign of a horrific crime. According to investigative documents, Rachelle was abducted from her home, raped, strangled to death, and her body burned to conceal the evidence. A young mother, with a whole future ahead of her, had her life cruelly snatched away. Who could commit such a heinous act against an innocent woman, and why? Moises Mendoza, born on January 26, 1984 in Mexico, was the perpetrator behind this horrific crime. Growing up in North Texas, Mendoza was once a standout student in high school, where he attended with Rachelle Tollison. In his early years, he was described as hardworking, intelligent, even earning scholarships for his academic achievements. After graduation, Mendoza completed 9 months of training in heating and air conditioning technology, seemingly building a stable future. But behind that promising facade were signs of instability. Acquaintances recalled that Mendoza began exhibiting violent behavior at a young age. One unforgettable incident involved him attacking his mother and sister in their front yard, violently holding them down. This act not only showed impulsiveness, but also indicated a worsening, unstable psyche. By 2003, Mendoza had fallen into a life of crime. He was arrested in connection with 2 armed robberies at the Dallas College Richland campus. When Rachelle disappeared, Mendoza was out on bail awaiting trial for one of these charges. Just days before the crime, he had even attended a small party with about 15 people at Rachelle's home. A chilling detail when considering the proximity between the perpetrator and victim before the tragedy. What pushed a once promising individual like Mendoza down a path of such criminality? Were his prior violent acts ignored warnings, or was there something deeper in his psychology that led to this horrific crime? On the night of March 18, 2004, in the peaceful town of Farmersville, Texas, a horrific crime shattered the tranquility of this small community. According to court documents, Mendoza broke into Rachelle Tollison's home through an unlocked back door. While little Avery slept, Mendoza approached the victim. Prosecutors argued that he abducted Rachelle from her home, exploiting their high school acquaintance to gain access without suspicion. However, Mendoza claimed they both left the house together to buy cigarettes, leaving Avery alone. According to this testimony, things went awry while they were driving. Mendoza suddenly became violent, strangling Rachelle until she lost consciousness. This act was not the result of an immediate argument, but rather seemed to be part of his cruel plan. After rendering Rachel unconscious, Mendoza took her to a secluded area near his home in Farmersville. In the darkness of the desolate field, he raped Rachel, then continued his brutal act by strangling her to death, even stabbing her in the throat to ensure she had no chance of survival. The brutality of this crime sent shivers down the spines of even seasoned investigators. After killing Rachel, Mendoza did not immediately dispose of the body. He left the victim's remains in the field for several days, as if contemplating his next move. Finally, Mendoza returned to the scene, wrapped the body in a tarp, took it to his cousin's property in Farmersville, burned it to destroy evidence, and then threw the remains into a nearby creek. This act not only demonstrated cruelty, but also Mendoza's cold-bloodedness in his attempt to conceal the crime. What compelled him to carry out such a heinous series of actions? Was this an outburst of an unstable mind or a meticulously planned scheme? Rachel Tolson's disappearance was discovered on the morning of March 18, 2004, when her mother visited and noticed something amiss. Little Avery was left alone, and Rachel was gone. The scene, the open back door, the chaotic bedroom immediately prompted the family to call the police. A large-scale search was launched in Farmersville, involving local police and specialized investigative teams. 5 days later, on March 23, 2004, a horrifying discovery shattered the Rachel family's hopes. Her burned body was found in a creek in Farmersville. Thanks to dental records, investigators identified the victim as Rachel Tolson. Forensic evidence, including burn marks in the condition of the body, indicated this was a murder committed with cruelty and intent. Just 1 day later, on March 24, 2004, Moises Mendoza was arrested. The impetus for the arrest came from a surprising detail. Mendoza confessed to a friend that he had killed Rachel. This confession, along with forensic evidence and traces at the scene, quickly linked Mendoza to the crime. Investigators also discovered he had been at Rachel's home a few days before the incident at a small party. This acquaintance led police to believe Mendoza had exploited Rachel's trust to approach her. The investigation demonstrated close cooperation among local police, forensic experts, and prosecutors in Collin County. But did Mendoza ever think he could escape justice forever? Or was he overconfident in his ability to conceal his crime? The trial of Moises Mendoza took place in 2005 in Collin County, Texas. He was prosecuted for capital murder related to the theft, kidnapping, and rape of Rachel Tolson. The trial garnered significant attention from the Farmersville community, where the case had left deep wounds. Prosecutor Greg Davis presented a clear picture of Mendoza's brutality, highlighting his history of violence, including attacks on his mother and sister, as well as a previous rape of a 14-year-old girl. Witnesses, including neighbors and acquaintances, provided testimony about Mendoza's unstable behavior, reinforcing the argument that he was a danger to society. Forensic evidence, including traces at the scene and the victim's body, was presented in detail to prove the savagery of the crime. The defense, in an attempt to mitigate the punishment, presented the opinion of psychologist Mark Vigan. Vigan described Mendoza as emotionally immature and showing signs of unstable psychological development. He argued that Mendoza often reacted angrily when criticized and found pleasure in deceiving others. However, these arguments failed to sway the jury, who were shocked by the level of cruelty of the crime. On June 29, 2005, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. The presiding judge concurred, sentencing Mendoza to death. Prosecutor Greg Davis called him one of the most violent and brutal individuals he had ever encountered in his career. Rachel's family, while feeling a measure of justice had been served, could not erase the pain of their loss. Did this death sentence truly bring closure? Or was it merely a concluding chapter in a tragedy? On April 23, 2025, at the Huntsville Unit Prison in Huntsville, Texas, Moises Mendoza, 41, walked into the execution chamber to face his fate. The execution by lethal injection, a common method in Texas, took place in a tense and silent atmosphere. According to unofficial sources, before his departure, Mendoza chose a last meal rich in the flavors of his Mexican homeland as a way to connect with his roots. A plate of tacos al pastor with fragrant roasted pork, pineapple and onions, a steaming bowl of sopa de fideo, the noodle soup his mother used to make, and a sweet horchata to soothe the bitterness of his final moments. Lying on the gurney, Mendoza offered an apology to his daughter and Rochelle Toloson's family. In a statement released afterward, he expressed remorse for taking a mother and loved one, admitting that nothing could compensate for his actions. Mendoza also sent words of love in Spanish to his wife, sister, and 2 close friends, saying, "I love you, I'm always with you, I'm fine and at peace." 19 minutes after the lethal dose was administered, Mendoza was pronounced dead, closing one of the most shocking cases in Farmersville. Witnesses, including representatives of Rochelle's family and officials, quietly observed the execution. There were no shouts or resistance, only a heavy silence pervading the room. Pam O'Neill, the victim's mother, witnessed the execution and later shared with the press, "He was on death row for 20 years. Today is the end. He died without pain. I wish I could say the same about my daughter's death." The case of Moises Sandoval Mendoza is not just a story of a brutal crime, but also a reminder of the deep wounds that violence leaves on families, communities, and society. Rochelle Tolson, a young mother with a whole future ahead of her, had her life stolen, leaving her daughter Avery orphaned and a family shattered. Rochelle's father, Mark O'Neill, though he did not forgive Mendoza, expressed sympathy for the killer's mother and sisters, who also suffered the pain of losing a loved one. But he affirmed that Mendoza had disregarded Rochelle's pleas and deserved to pay the price long ago. Collin County District Attorney Greg Willis, in a statement after the execution, emphasized that Rochelle's death had shocked the entire community and left indelible pain. He asserted that the death penalty was a way to honor Rochelle's life, hoping her family found some comfort. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton also expressed support, pledging to continue upholding the law and holding criminals accountable. This case raises profound questions about justice and society. What transformed Moises Mendoza, a young man who once had good academic achievements and opportunities ahead, into an uncompromising killer? What can society do to identify and prevent early signs of instability? And more importantly, does the death penalty, with its perceived necessary brutality for punishment, truly bring justice? Or is it merely a way to respond to violence with violence? Rochelle and Mendoza's story has been reenacted in shows like Forensic Files in 2006 and Solved in 2008 as a reminder of the cost of crime and the fragility of life. This case is not just a personal tragedy, but also a warning about the importance of building a safer society where people like Rochelle can live without fear. What do you think about Moises Mendoza's fate, and what lessons does this story leave us with today? Jamila Hodge, CEO of Equal Justice USA, shared with Newsweek, Equal Justice USA is firmly opposed to the death penalty. The death penalty is not justice. It doesn't heal families. It doesn't deter crime. It deepens suffering, wastes public resources, and maintains a racist system that harshly punishes the poor and marginalized. Worse, the death penalty carries the greatest risk, the possibility of killing an innocent person. Since 1973, at least 200 innocent people have been exonerated after being wrongly convicted. She added, "Look at the states that have abolished the death penalty or don't use it. They have lower murder rates, lower violence rates, because they don't waste resources on the most extreme punishment, but instead invest in community-based public safety solutions. It's time to abolish the death penalty in the United States." So what do you think? Should the death penalty be abolished? T25. Gunshots rang out in the cold morning, ending the life of a man who once shocked the entire United States with his heinous crimes. Michael Dean Motti, 42, executed by firing squad, a rare form of capital punishment in the modern era. In today's video, we will explore the last meal he chose to the last words he spoke before looking directly into the barrel of a gun. In July 2004, at the age of 21, Michael Dean Motti unleashed a wave of violence across 3 states, leaving a trail of death and destruction. The crime spree began in his home state of Virginia, where he was accused of killing Greg Jones, a man he met during a failed drug deal. According to police reports, Motti stabbed Jones to death, leaving the body 2 miles from his residence. A knife recovered from Motti's home contained DNA from both Motti and Jones. Although Motti was not tried for this murder despite confessing, fleeing Virginia, Motti stole a .380 caliber handgun, a scooter, and Virginia license plates, setting the stage for his subsequent crimes. On July 14, 2004, Motti drove to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at a convenience store. He selected a can of beer and approached the checkout counter, where a 29-year-old clerk Christopher Jason Boggs requested identification. Without warning, Motti shot Boggs in the face at close range. As Boggs fell, Motti fired another shot into the motionless body. Unable to open the cash register, Motti fled with only the can of beer, leaving behind a scene of senseless slaughter. 2 days later, on July 17th, Motti arrived in Columbia, South Carolina. There, he carjacked Corey Pitt, stealing his vehicle and replacing its license plates with the stolen Virginia plates. After a failed attempt to purchase gas with a credit card at a local gas station, Motti's suspicious behavior prompted the station attendant to call the police, forcing him to flee on foot. He found refuge at a farm in Calhoun County owned by 56-year-old Captain James Myers, a veteran of the Orangeburg Public Safety Department. Myers, who had spent the day celebrating his daughter's, sister's, and wife's birthdays at a beach, returned to his farm, unaware of the danger lurking. Motti, hidden in the farm's workshop, discovered Myers' gun collection. As Myers entered, Motti grabbed a .22 caliber rifle, confronted the officer, and shot him 9 times, including 3 shots to the head, ensuring instant death. In a final act of barbarity, Motti poured diesel fuel over Myers' body and set it on fire. He then stole Myers' police truck, a .22 caliber rifle, an assault rifle, and a personal handgun and fled the scene. That evening, Myers' wife, Amy Tripp Myers, also a law enforcement officer, found her husband's charred body in a pool of blood and reported the incident to the police. What turned a young man into such an unyielding killer? Michael Dean Motti was born on March 20th, 1983 in the small town of Lawrenceville, Virginia. His early life was marked by instability and chaos, foreshadowing the criminal path he would later embark on. Mahal's father, Sharif, a former Marine who converted to Islam and changed his name, struggled with alcoholism and a troubled family history. Sharif's inability to provide a stable home environment left deep scars on Mahal and his brother Salim. Their mother abandoned the family in 1986 when Mikhail was just 3 years old, leaving Sharif to raise the 2 boys alone. However, Sharif was ill-equipped for fatherhood, often neglecting his children and getting into conflicts with law enforcement. By 1991, unable to continue, Sharif sent Mikhail and Salim to live with relatives. Salim went to Texas to live with an aunt, while Mikhail, then 8, was sent to live with his aunt and uncle in Maryland. In Baltimore, Mikhail attended Scotts Branch Elementary School, where he showed flashes of enthusiasm, but struggled to respect authority and fell behind in literacy skills. Teachers noted that he had low self-esteem and difficulty forming relationships. Mikhail's academic journey ended abruptly when he dropped out in the 3rd grade. Despite this, Mikhail later managed to earn his GED and a community college degree by the age of 21, a testament to his potential, but not enough to pull him from his destructive path. Diagnosed with severe depressive disorder at age 9, Mikhail's psychological problems led to his involuntary commitment to the Walter P. Carter Center after threatening suicide. Discharged in October 1992, he returned to Virginia to live with his father and brother, but his troubles were far from over. McCall's criminal path began early. At 14, in December 1997, he was convicted of 2 counts of grand larceny and 2 counts of breaking and entering, serving time in a juvenile facility where he endured 75 days of solitary confinement. By the age of 21, he faced another 8 months in solitary confinement. In 2001, Motti was convicted of assaulting a police officer in Virginia, resulting in a 93-month prison sentence and 15 years of probation. Released in May 2004, he returned to Richmond to live with his mother, but just 2 months later, he began a spree of violent crimes that would make his name infamous. Motti's flight did not last long. Driving Myers' stolen truck, he headed to Florida, where police located him on July 21, 2004 at Satellite Beach. A tense confrontation ensued as Motti, armed with Myers' rifle, initially resisted. Ultimately, he dropped his weapon and surrendered. The FBI, along with agencies in Virginia and North Carolina, linked Motti to the killings of Jones, Boggs, and Myers through forensic evidence, including the knife in Virginia and surveillance footage from the Winston-Salem convenience store. Motti was extradited to South Carolina to face charges for Myers' murder, with additional charges pending in North Carolina. Motti's trial in South Carolina for the murder of James Myers began in November 2006 in Calhoun County. Indicted for murder, second-degree burglary, and grand larceny, Motti faced a prosecution team led by David Pascoe, who sought the death penalty at the request of the Myers family and local authorities. The trial was nearly disrupted when authorities discovered a homemade handcuff key in Motti's pocket, leading to the implementation of stricter security measures. On November 28, 2006, just before the jury began deliberations, Motti pleaded guilty to all charges. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, citing Motti's hatred and malice, his desecration of Myers' body, and his extensive criminal history, including a 1998 threat to kill police officers. Amy Myers testified about the profound loss of her husband, who was killed in the very workshop where they had held their wedding in 2003. The defense sought a life sentence, emphasizing Motti's difficult childhood, absent mother, and neglectful father. On December 8, 2006, Judge Clifton Newman sentenced Motti to death, declaring that his actions showed no remorse or humanity. Newman noted Motti's attempt to escape with a handcuff key and his history of violence against law enforcement, concluding by extinguishing Captain Myers' life, hopes, and dreams in a malicious, depraved, and remorseless manner. The defendant, Motti also extinguished any legitimate claim to the mercy he sought from this court. Motti also received consecutive sentences of 15 years and 10 years for burglary and grand larceny. At 23, he became the youngest death row inmate in South Carolina. In December 2011, Motti was extradited to North Carolina to face charges for Christopher Boggs' murder. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole by Judge Richard Stone. Boggs' mother was present in court to witness the sentencing. As Motti was already on death row in South Carolina, he was sent back to continue serving his sentence there. In 2009, while incarcerated at Lieber Correctional Institution, Motti and fellow death row inmate Quincy Allen conspired to kill a correctional officer, Nathan Sasser. Using homemade knives fashioned from metal strips from a ventilation duct, they attacked Sasser on the prison basketball court, stabbing him multiple times. Their escape attempt failed when other guards subdued them with pepper spray and rubber bullets. Sasser survived but suffered from PTSD, leading to his subsequent dismissal. Motti and Allen faced assault charges, but these were later dropped, as both had already received death sentences. Motti's appeals spanned over a decade, beginning in 2009 when he appealed to the South Carolina Supreme Court, which unanimously upheld his death sentence. Justice Costa M. Pelecanis rejected Motti's argument that his plea was punitive, while Chief Justice Jean H. Toll called him one of the most deserving individuals of the death penalty she had ever seen. Federal appeals in 2017, 2018, and 2021 were also denied. In 2023, Motti joined other death row inmates in a lawsuit challenging South Carolina's use of the firing squad and electric chair as cruel and unusual punishment. The state countered that both methods were constitutional, and the South Carolina Supreme Court affirmed their legality in July 2024, paving the way for executions to resume after a 13-year hiatus. Motti's final appeal, filed on March 18, 2025, argued that his trial counsel was ineffective, failing to present sufficient mitigating evidence about his childhood. The South Carolina Supreme Court rejected this on April 7th, 2025, citing Motti's long history of violence. Final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court and a clemency petition from Motti's life on death row at Lieber Correctional Institution was far from peaceful. In 2009, he and fellow death row inmate Quincy Allen conspired to attack and kill a correctional officer, Nathan Sasser. Using homemade knives made from metal strips from a ventilation duct, they approached Sasser under the pretense of wanting to go to the basketball court. As Sasser escorted them, Motti and Allen suddenly attacked, stabbing him multiple times before attempting to escape by climbing over the prison fence. This attempt failed when other guards subdued them with pepper spray and rubber bullets. Sasser fortunately survived, but the attack left him with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, leading to his dismissal from his job. Motti and Allen were charged with assault, but these charges were later dropped as both had already received death sentences, a decision suggesting the justice system's unwillingness to prolong litigation with those already facing the highest penalty. This event further highlighted Motti's uncompromising nature. Even while held under strict conditions, he found ways to incite violence, as if nothing could contain the aggression within him. This led many to wonder, did Motti ever truly feel remorse? Or was he entirely caught in a spiral of destruction? On August 28, 2024, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued an order allowing 6 executions to take place over the next year, with each spaced 35 days apart. Motti was among the 6 death row inmates listed, along with Freddie Eugene Owens, Richard Bernard Moore, Marion Bowman Jr., Stephen Bixby, and Brad Sigmund. Owens and Moore were executed on September 20 and November 1st, 2024, respectively, marking the return of capital punishment in South Carolina after a 13-year hiatus. Motti was scheduled for execution on April 11, 2025, and was required to choose his method of execution by March 28, 2025. Lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. Motti chose the firing squad, becoming the second death row inmate in South Carolina since 2025 to select this method. According to his lawyer, David Weiss, Motti feared being burned and mutilated by the electric chair or a prolonged death on a lethal injection gurney. The firing squad, though brutal, was seen by Motti as the least bad of the three options. This decision reflected a cold calculation, no different from the actions he had taken in the past. On April 11, 2025, Michael Dean Motti, 42, faced the firing squad at Broad River Correctional Institution. Before the execution, he was served his last meal, a simple but haunting choice: medium rare beef tenderloin, mushroom medley rice, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. These dishes, ordinary yet carefully chosen, seemed to be Motti's final attempt to find some comfort in his last moments. However, when asked for his last words, Motti remained silent, expressing no remorse or plea for forgiveness. At 6:01 p.m., the firing squad opened fire. According to witnesses, Motti cried out as the first bullet struck him, his body convulsing and groaning for 45 seconds, continuing to gasp for 80 seconds before lying motionless. A doctor pronounced him dead at 6:05 p.m. Less than 4 minutes after the shots were fired. A subsequent autopsy revealed that only 2 of the 3 shots hit Motti and none struck his heart, explaining why he remained conscious for over a minute after being shot. Motti's death, though swift by execution standards, still left a chilling impression of the brutality of this punishment. Witnesses at the execution included Motti's lawyer, David Weiss, journalists from the National News Desk, Lee Enterprises, and the Associated Press, along with Calhoun County Sheriff Thomas Summers and an unnamed member of the Myers family. Weiss later criticized the execution, calling it barbaric and a horrifying act belonging to the darkest chapters of history. Meanwhile, Summers, who called Motti evil, expressed satisfaction that justice had been served. Motti's execution sparked mixed reactions. James Myers' daughter, now married with children, stated that she had forgiven Motti, but chose not to witness the execution. She expressed her desire to forget the painful past and focus on positive memories of her father, whom she described as a man with wisdom beyond his years. She also lamented that her father never got to meet her 3 young daughters born after the murder. Nathan Sasser, the correctional officer attacked by Motti and Allen in 2009, shared that he still struggles with work and life due to psychological trauma, but hoped those affected by Motti would find solace. Calhoun County Sheriff Thomas Summers, who was in his first term when Myers was killed, attended the execution and made no secret of his contempt for Motti. Meanwhile, lawyer David Weiss continued to condemn the firing squad, calling it an act unworthy of a civilized society. The journalists present, including Brian McConchie, Martha Rose Brown, and Jeffrey Collins, documented the chilling details of the execution, helping to bring Motti's story to public light. The case of Michael Dean Motti remains one of South Carolina's most infamous death penalty cases. As the second person to be executed by firing squad in the state since 1976, Motti's death reignited fierce debates about capital punishment. Was this justice or merely a legalized form of revenge? Motti's traumatic childhood with an absent mother and years of isolation may partially explain his behavior, but is it enough to justify his brutal crime? The scars he left on the families of Greg Jones, Christopher Jason Boggs, and James Myers are a testament to the terrible cost of violence. This case also raises questions about society's responsibility. Can we prevent such tragedies by intervening earlier in the lives of individuals like Motti? Motti's story is not just the story of a killer, it is also a warning about how childhood trauma, a lack of affection, and wrong choices can lead a person to the brink of destruction. When the firing squad's shots rang out, they not only ended Motti's life, but also left a lingering question. How do we prevent other Michael Dean Mottis in the future? In 2014, the air inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary was heavy, as if foreshadowing a storm. Guards moved urgently, their eyes tense. In the operations room, phones rang incessantly. An urgent call from inside the prison had just been transferred to the office of Director Robert Patton. That call marked the beginning of one of the most controversial executions in American history. Clayton Lockett, a death row inmate convicted of murder, rape, and kidnapping, did not die as planned. Instead, he endured 43 minutes of agony before his heart finally stopped. What happened? And why would a state allow a human being to die in such torment? To understand why Clayton Lockett ended up on the execution gurney, we must go back to his past, a childhood full of pain and violence. Born in 1975, Lockett grew up in the shadow of abandonment and abuse. His mother left him when he was 3, leaving the boy with a cruel father. His father beat Lockett mercilessly, forced him to use drugs from a young age, and taught him how to steal without getting caught. In 1992, at the age of 16, Lockett entered the spiral of crime. He pleaded guilty to burglary and knowingly concealing stolen property in Kay County, receiving a 7-year prison sentence. That same year, he was charged with intimidating state witnesses. But prison didn't reform him, it broke him. At the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, an adult facility, Lockett was gang raped by 3 adult prisoners. That psychological scar turned him into a ticking time bomb. In 1996, Lockett received another 4-year sentence for conspiracy to commit a felony in Grady County, but the fateful crime occurred in June 1999 when he was 24. Lockett, along with 2 accomplices, Alfonso VZ Lockett and Sean Mathis, attacked a group of young people, including Stephanie Neiman, a 19-year-old high school graduate. Neiman was an unwitting witness to the robbery and kidnapping. He used duct tape to bind Neiman's hands and cover her mouth, taking her to a remote area in Perry, Oklahoma. There he raped her. When Neiman vowed to go to the police if released, Lockett coldly decided to kill her. He shot her from about 2 meters with a 12-gauge shotgun slug, knocking her to the ground with a torn chest and shoulder. The gun jammed. Lockett calmly used a screwdriver to unjam his shotgun, returned, and shot her again. Still not dead. Neiman was then ordered by Lockett for his accomplices to bury her alive. She died from her wounds, lying beneath the cold earth. On June 4, 1999, Detective David Farrow arrested Lockett and his accomplices at a convenience store in Enid, Oklahoma. The shotgun used in the murder was found hidden in a box spring mattress in a garage where Lockett had been staying. 86 pieces of evidence, from Neiman's DNA to fingerprints on the duct tape, were presented at trial. In 2000, Lockett was sentenced to death for murder, rape, kidnapping, assault, and other charges. Alfonso and Mathis received life sentences, but the question remains haunting. Did a ruined childhood lead Lockett down this path? Or was he a cold-blooded killer beyond redemption? On April 29, 2014, in a special cell just steps from the execution chamber, Clayton Lockett, 38, faced his last meal. There was no special menu for death row inmates in Oklahoma, a cold prison policy. He could only choose from the daily menu like any other inmate. But in that moment, the meal was more than just food. It was a brief pause before the 43-minute nightmare to come. On the gray plastic tray placed before Lockett was a simple meal: a dry piece of roasted beef, a few cold French fries, a bland plate of boiled green beans, and a cloudy glass of orange juice. There was no dessert, no luxury. The smell of charred meat mingled with the musty air of the cell, a grim reminder that this was no meal of freedom. Lockett sat on the steel bed, his eyes empty, the plastic spoon trembling slightly in his hand. He refused the food tray twice that day, as if wanting to deny the impending death. But finally he ate, slowly, piece by piece, without a word. That meal offered no comfort. It was a symbol of a cold system where even a human being's final moments were stripped of solemnity. Lockett, who had taken Stephanie Neiman's life, now faced his fate in absolute solitude. No family, no shared words, just a bland food tray and death awaiting. Did he think of the 19-year-old girl buried alive? Or was he simply trying to swallow each bite to forget the lethal drugs to come? In early 2014, Clayton Lockett had been on death row for 14 years. He knew his execution date was approaching, but no one expected his execution to turn into a tragedy. Oklahoma was facing a lethal drug crisis. In 2011, Hospira, the manufacturer of sodium thiopenol, the standard anesthetic, ceased production due to its opposition to capital punishment. U.S. states then faced a severe shortage of execution drugs. Some states bartered supplies, while others were accused of illegally purchasing drugs from India. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration seized sodium Thiopnol from several states, escalating the situation. The European Union also banned the export of drugs used for executions. Oklahoma was forced to experiment with a new drug mixture, midazolam to induce unconsciousness, vicuronium bromide to paralyze, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. This mixture had never been used in the U.S. before. Florida had used these three drugs in a 2013 execution, but with a midazolam dose 5 times higher. Oklahoma's secrecy laws concealed the source of the drugs, how they were acquired, and the reason for choosing this mixture. Reports indicated that the drugs were bought with petty cash, making the transaction hard to trace. Governor Mary Fallin was determined to proceed with the execution despite a stay from the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Her Republican allies threatened impeachment proceedings against the justices who tried to delay the execution. Lockett's lawyers requested that the source of the drugs be disclosed, but this was refused. Lockett's stepmother, LaDonna Hollins, expressed concern. What mixture of drugs are you going to use now? Is this instant? Is this going to cause horrible pain? He says he's not scared of dying so much as the drugs administered. On the morning of April 29, Lockett refused to cooperate. He cut himself in his cell, forcing guards to use a taser to subdue him. He refused 2 meals. In the medical room, staff found a cut on his right arm, but it didn't require sutures. Lockett was then moved to a special cell 4 meters from the execution chamber, cold, silent, with only a steel bed and a sink. At 6:00 p.m., the prison went into lockdown. Lockett, dressed in clean clothes, was led by 2 guards to the execution chamber. He was not handcuffed, but his eyes were vacant. Behind the glass, Stephanie Neiman's family, lawyer Dean Sanderford, and reporters sat in silence. Fluorescent lights illuminated the cold room. Lockett was strapped securely to his stainless steel gurney, his arms outstretched as needles were prepared for insertion into his veins. At 6:23 p.m., the execution began. A paramedic tried to insert an IV needle into Lockett's left arm, but failed. She then tried a vein in his bicep, also unsuccessfully. Dr. Johnny Zelmer was called in. He tried 3 times to insert the IV into Lockett's jugular vein in his neck, then the subclavian vein near his collarbone. All failed. The paramedic tried 2 veins in his left foot, to no avail. Finally, Zelmer inserted the needle into the femoral vein in the groin, covering the area with a cloth to shield it from witnesses' view. At 6:33 p.m., after midazolam was administered, Zelmer declared Lockett unconscious. But at 6:36 p.m., everything collapsed. Lockett began to convulse, violently groaning, saying, "Oh man, I'm not, and something's wrong." He tried to lift his head, exhaling loudly as if trying to escape the gurney. Lawyer Sanderford was horrified. It looked like torture. Staff discovered that the femoral IV connection had failed due to a collapsed vein, and the drugs had either absorbed into tissue or leaked out. The covering cloth had prevented them from noticing earlier. At 6:56 p.m., Director Patton ordered a halt to the execution. Dr. Zelmer confirmed that Lockett had not received a sufficient dose to cause death, and there were no remaining drugs to attempt another injection. Guards discussed taking Lockett to a hospital, but no action was taken. At 7:06 p.m., Lockett died of a heart attack after 43 agonizing minutes. No life-saving measures were provided. The execution chamber fell silent. Neiman's family wept, not because Lockett had died, but because of the vivid memory of the 19-year-old girl buried alive. Reporters meticulously documented every detail, preparing for the media storm that was about to erupt. Clayton Lockett's death did not close a painful chapter. It opened a fierce debate about capital punishment in the United States. President Barack Obama called the incident deeply disturbing, ordering Attorney General Eric Holder to review execution policies. He highlighted the uneven application of the death penalty, from racial bias to cases where wrongful convictions were later overturned. The United Nations suggested that the execution may have constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law, and cruel and unusual punishment under the U.S. Constitution. The British government urged the U.S. to cease capital punishment, emphasizing that its use undermines human dignity. In Oklahoma, Governor Mary Fallin ordered a review of the execution protocol, but lawyer Dean Sanderford doubted its independence. How can one trust an investigation by the state itself? The execution of Charles Warner, scheduled for 2 hours after Lockett's, was postponed for 14 days. Warner was eventually executed in January 2015. But the controversy did not subside. Human rights organizations strongly condemned the event. Ryan Kiesel of the ACLU of Oklahoma called the incident state-sponsored torture. Antonio Giannata of Human Rights Watch stressed convicted individuals should not be test subjects for a state's grisly experiments. The rate of botched lethal injections in the United States is 7.1%, higher than any other method, from the electric chair to the gas chamber. Lockett's story also raises questions about him as an individual. He was undeniably a brutal criminal. Stephanie Neiman, 19, was raped, shot, and buried alive by him just for threatening to go to the police. Her family would never forgive him. But did Lockett's childhood, abandoned, abused, raped in prison, partly explain the monster he became? Or was it merely an excuse for the blood he shed? Pharmacologist Craig Stevens from Oklahoma State University criticized, midazolam has no analgesic properties. It's a completely different drug class than sodium thiopental. Dying from the other two drugs without an anesthetic is horrific. This drug combination is even forbidden for animal euthanasia in some states. The Lockett case forced Oklahoma and other states to reevaluate their execution protocols. Some states temporarily halted executions while others switched to different methods, such as firing squads. But the larger question still hangs. Can capital punishment be humane, and who is responsible when it fails? Mary Fallon, the drug manufacturers, or the entire justice system? The story of Clayton Lockett is not just about a criminal or a botched execution. It is a mirror reflecting the flaws in justice, the wounds of society, and the cost of retribution. Lockett was a killer, but did his death lessen the pain of Stephanie Neiman's family? Or did it merely create another scar? What are your thoughts on this case? Should capital punishment continue, or is it time to end it? Please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and spread this story to raise awareness. The quiet town of Idaho Falls, Idaho, was gripped by terror. An unseen predator stalked under the moonlight, sowing death among innocent lives. Paul Ezra Rhodes, a 30-year-old man with vacant eyes and a heart ravaged by drugs, turned 3 winter weeks into an unforgettable nightmare. 3 lives were brutally extinguished and a community was ripped apart. In today's video, we'll delve into the chilling details of his last meal, the haunting final words he uttered before his gaze faded, and the lingering question, was justice truly served, or was it simply another nightmare brought to an end? Paul Ezra Rhodes was born on January 18, 1957, in Idaho Falls, Idaho, into what appeared to be an ordinary family. The eldest of 4 siblings, young Paul grew up amidst childish laughter, punctuated by the incessant arguments of his parents, Augustus and Pauline Rhodes. But fate had already etched a cruel mark upon his life. At just 4 years old, Paul contracted polio. The long, arduous days spent in hospitals, the tormenting pain in his fragile body, transformed him into a solitary child, perpetually on the fringes of the world. At home, the suffocating atmosphere was no different from the hospital. Paul's parents constantly bickered, their quarrels like knives carving into his soul. By age 10, Paul sought refuge in alcohol to escape reality. Just a few years later, he dropped out of high school, sinking deep into drug addiction, a poison that corroded him from within. Methamphetamine became his constant companion, transforming Paul from a timid boy into an unstable man, perpetually craving something to fill the void in his soul. To survive, Paul drifted through various odd jobs, from construction to drywall installation, wandering across Idaho and neighboring states. But by night, he transformed into a phantom, breaking into homes, stealing anything of value. Each petty theft nurtured a demon within him, ready to explode into something far more horrifying. The winter of 1987 saw Idaho Falls and Blackfoot enveloped in a biting cold. Yet, that chill was nothing compared to the pervasive fear that had taken root. A killer was lurking somewhere, and no one knew when he would strike again. Stacey Dawn Baldwin, 21, was working the night shift at the Red Mini Barn convenience store in Blackfoot on February 28, 1987. This young woman, with her radiant smile, had just married, dreaming of a happy future. But that night, her dream was dealt a fatal blow. Paul Rhodes walked into the store, his eyes bloodshot from methamphetamine. He didn't just want money, he wanted control, dominance. Stacey was held at gunpoint, forced into his pickup truck, and driven to a secluded area. She bravely tried to resist, fleeing across a snow-covered field, but Rhodes, like a relentless predator, fired 3 shots into her back. The next morning, Stacey's body was found at an archery range 5 miles from Blackfoot. her blood staining the white snow. The robbery yielded only a few dollars, but the cost was an entire life. Just 10 days later, on the morning of March 17, Nolan Haddon, 20, was working at Buck's convenience store in Idaho Falls. The young man with flowing blonde hair, apprenticing at a technical school, had no idea that death was near. Rhodes entered, gun in hand. Some investigators later suspected that Rhodes mistook Nolan for a woman because of his long hair, but that detail ceased to matter. He robbed the store, forced Nolan into the store's walk-in cooler, and fired 5 shots into him. Nolan was found hours later lying in a pool of blood, his breath shallow. Despite being rushed to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, he took his last breath. The community of Idaho Falls began to panic. 2 murders in less than 2 weeks. Who would be the next victim? On March 19, 1987, Susan Michelbacher, 34, a special education teacher at Eagle Rock Junior High, left home early to drop off lesson plans. She felt unwell, intending to return home shortly thereafter, but she never did. Rhodes had been stalking Susan from a supermarket parking lot. He pulled her into his pickup truck, forcing her to cash 2 checks totaling $1,000.00 at 2 different banks. Afterward, he drove her to a remote lava field west of Idaho Falls. There, Susan was shot 9 times, her blood seeping into the volcanic rock. More horrifying still, she was raped, possibly even post-mortem. Susan's body was discovered 2 days later on March 21, a grim warning that Idaho Falls was no longer safe. Rhodes' brutality wasn't limited to these 3 murders. On March 3, a female student at Ricks College, now Brigham Young University, Idaho, in Rexburg, reported being robbed of $90.00, kidnapped at gunpoint, and raped in a potato cellar near Walker Siding. She was fortunate enough to be released, and her testimony, describing a tall, long-haired man driving a pickup truck, matched clues police were already pursuing. Though Rhodesburg did not prosecute Rhodes for this incident, the information proved crucial in tightening the noose around him. On March 25, Rhodes crashed his mother's car near Wells, Nevada, and wandered into a casino. Police found the car, confiscating a handgun and ammunition. Upon examination, they were stunned. The bullets in the gun matched perfectly with those from the murders in Blackfoot and Idaho Falls. On March 27, Rhodes was arrested at the casino, still dazed from drugs. As he was being escorted, he unexpectedly blurted out, "I did it." This vague confession became the key that unlocked a horrifying chain of crimes. Rhodes was extradited back to Idaho, facing charges for the murder of Susan Michelbacher, along with kidnapping, robbery, rape, desecration of a body, and weapons violations. The murders of Baldwin and Haddon were tried separately, ensuring each of his heinous crimes was brought to justice. On January 18, 1988, the first trial began in Bonneville County. Rhodes, now 31, sat in the courtroom in a rumpled suit, his eyes avoiding contact. Notably, Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus nearly became a juror, but was excused as he had signed the order for Rhodes' extradition from Nevada. Prosecutors presented compelling evidence, bullets from Rhodes' gun and the testimony of witness Valerie Staff, who saw a man resembling Rhodes in a pickup truck with a woman resembling Susan on the morning she disappeared. Detective Victor Rodriguez sent ripples through the courtroom when he testified that Rhodes had confessed to killing Susan while in custody, though he failed to record the statement due to oversight. Defense attorney John Radin countered, accusing Rodriguez of lying, but the jury was swayed by the undeniable physical evidence. On January 26, the trial was delayed for 2 hours because Rhodes' suit was at the dry cleaners, but that delay did not save him. The next day, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Rhodes guilty on all counts. On March 24th, Judge Larry Boyle sentenced him to death for murder, along with life imprisonment for the other crimes. As the verdict was read, Rhodes erupted in a rage, throwing a chair at the prosecutor, but was immediately subdued by police. On March 3, the Baldwin trial began in Bingham County. Rhodes' lawyers attempted to cast out, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, such as unusually large shoe prints or a watch believed to belong to Baldwin found on Rhodes. They claimed Rhodes' mother had bought the watch as a Christmas gift, but the prosecutor countered. The bullets from Rhodes' gun and the shoe prints were irrefutable. On March 12th, Rhodes was found guilty. On May 13, Judge James Herndon handed down a second death sentence, along with life imprisonment and 45 years for related charges. On April 25, Rhodes pleaded guilty to the Haddon case with conditions to avoid a lengthy trial while still reserving the right to appeal. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, though he continued to maintain his innocence. Nevertheless, the evidence, from the gun bullets to his brutal behavior, painted the portrait of a cold-blooded killer. For the next 24 years, Rhodes lived in an 8 to 12-foot cell at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, windowless, allowed out for only 1 hour a day to see the sky through a steel fence. He and his lawyers filed continuous appeals, citing his unfortunate childhood, drug addiction, and arguing that lethal injection was cruel and unusual. But every effort was rejected. Rhodes spent his time reading, drawing, and receiving visits from his mother, the only woman who didn't turn her back on him. He claimed to have changed, to feel remorse, but the victims' families didn't believe him. "He's a coward," Nolan Haddon's mother stated. "He never really faced his crimes." On November 18, 2011, after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to review his final appeal, Rhodes received his execution order. He was transferred to a special cell, facing the execution chamber where his fate would be sealed. The final moments had arrived. On the morning of November 18th, 2011, at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise, Paul Ezra Rhodes, now 54, walked into the execution chamber. Outside, about 50 protesters opposed to the death penalty held signs asking, "What would Jesus do?" Meanwhile, a small group supporting capital punishment stood silently across the way. Rhodes was served his last meal: hot dogs, baked beans, and strawberry ice cream. The night before, he had a light meal of cheese and crackers and took sedatives to remain calm. Lying on the injection gurney, hands and feet shackled, he looked at his mother one last time through the glass. With a clear voice, he said, "I'm sorry to Bert Mickelbacher for my role in his wife's death. To the Baldwin and Haddon families, you must continue your search. I can offer no help. I am sorry." He then turned to the warden and said, "Mom, goodbye. Brothers, I forgive you truly." The Baldwin and Haddon families were enraged. "He lied to the very end," Stacy's brother whispered. "How cowardly," Nolan's mother said. But a friend of the Michelbacher family breathed a sigh of relief. "The devil has gone home." At 9:15 a.m., after 22 minutes, Rhodes was pronounced dead. His body was cremated and the ashes given to his lawyer. Idaho concluded its first execution in 17 years, but the pain of the families remained unclosed. Paul Ezra Rhodes, a name that once sent shivers of terror through Idaho Falls in 1987. Who was he? A child whose soul was stifled by an unfortunate childhood, a man whose sanity was incinerated by drugs, or a monster in human form born to sow death. 3 lives. Stacy Baldwin, Nolan Haddon, Susan Michelbacher, were brutally stolen by his hand, leaving bleeding scars forever etched in the hearts of those who remained. On November 18th, 2011, as the lethal injection stilled his heart, justice seemingly prevailed. But was it merely a somber note in an unending cycle of retribution where blood answered blood and sorrow piled upon sorrow? Imagine a small town bathed in cold moonlight, where families once embraced in joy now face empty chairs around their dining tables. Stacy, the 21-year-old dreaming of marital bliss, was shot dead in a snow-covered field. Nolan, the 20-year-old with flowing blonde hair, fell in the cold storage room of a convenience store. Susan, the dedicated 34-year-old teacher, was dragged into the darkness of a lava field. They weren't just victims. They were stories interrupted, dreams brutally extinguished. Rhodes didn't just steal lives. He stole hope, faith, and the very light from an entire community. Did Rhodes' death in that cold execution chamber in Boise truly soothe that immense pain? Or was it simply an ancient ritual where society attempts to mask its own fear of the darkness within itself? He offered an apology in his final moments, but can those words, whether genuine or feigned, ever restore what was lost? And what about us, those who bear witness from afar? Should we confine such lost souls endlessly in windowless cells? Should we end their lives to appease our anger? Or should we seek ways to prevent such monsters from being born in the first place? The story of Paul Ezra Rhodes isn't just a criminal file. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest corners, where the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes be far more fragile than we imagine. It reminds us that darkness can lurk within anyone, but so too can the light of justice, compassion, and forgiveness. What are your thoughts on Rhodes' fate? Was his death justice, or just another chapter in a relentless tragedy? Please share your reflections in the comments section. Every opinion is a piece in humanity's larger narrative. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to join us on future journeys into the truth of criminal cases.
In 1989, the small town of Rochester, Michigan was gripped by terror. An invisible predator stalked under the moonlight, sowing death among the innocent. Aileen Wuornos, a woman who shocked the public with her disturbing crimes, is the subject of today's video. We'll explore her final meal, the haunting last words she uttered before her eyes dimmed, and the lingering question, was justice truly served, or was it just another nightmare? The life of Aileen Wuornos, the woman who entered American criminal history with the moniker the Highway Killer, is a tragic ballad deeply steeped in misery and abandonment from her earliest years. Born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, under the name Aileen Carol Pittman, cruel fate seemed to entangle the little girl from the moment of her birth. Aileen's mother, unable to bear the responsibility of raising two children, handed Aileen and her brother Keith over to their father, an immoral, violent man, for care. The childhood of the two children thus passed amidst hatred and abuse. Just a few years later, tragedy struck again when their father died. Aileen and Keith once more became orphaned children, forced to move in with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. This was a fateful turning point because after being legally adopted by their grandparents, Aileen and Keith changed their surname to Wuornos. But ironically, this new home brought no peace. Their grandparents were also alcoholics and no less violent than their deceased father. Aileen grew up in an environment filled with shouting violence and indifference, leaving her soul scarred and deeply wounded. The even crueler truth was only discovered by Aileen when she was 12 years old. Lori and Britta were not her adoptive parents, but her biological maternal grandparents. From this point, Aileen began to rebel against those who had raised her in torment. The emotional scars from childhood were deeply etched into Aileen's mind, turning her into a different child, distant and hostile towards the world around her. As early as 11 years old, Aileen had to learn to trade sex for candy and cigarettes at school, an alarming sign of her lack of affection and guidance. In 1971, at just 14 years old, Aileen became pregnant. By 15, she gave birth and had to give the baby up for adoption. Another pain piled upon her young life. Later, Wuornos even had an incestuous relationship with her brother Keith. His subsequent death sent Aileen's life into a rapid decline. She became reckless, fell into drug addiction, and worked as a prostitute to survive. From an abandoned child, Aileen gradually transformed into a criminal, involved in a series of robberies, bar fights, and frequent stints in prison, until she drifted south to Florida, a region of sunshine and wind where the most horrific tragedies were about to unfold. After years of violent childhood and abandonment, Aileen Wuornos drifted to Florida, a seemingly vibrant place that would continue to push her into a cycle of crime. There, Aileen had a fleeting marriage with Louis Fell, a wealthy old man. However, Aileen quickly revealed her violent nature and tendency to steal her husband's money, causing the marriage to quickly dissolve. Once again, Aileen was left on the streets, and her life entered a new chapter of criminality, specializing in forging documents, petty theft, and living as a drifter. For many years, Aileen was in and out of prison constantly. Prison seemed to become a familiar part of her undirected life. The next turning point in Aileen's downward spiral occurred in 1986 when she met Tyria Moore in a gay bar. These two street women quickly became lovers. During this period, Aileen continued to work as a prostitute on the highway to support both of them, and they lived together in a shabby motel by the roadside. Life reliant on money earned from selling her body, along with an unstable relationship, quickly drained their finances. Eventually, the relationship between Aileen and Tyria also ended, and they went their separate ways. This was the fateful moment when the separation, along with the accumulated trauma and resentment, pushed Aileen Wuornos onto a terrifying criminal path, the path of a serial killer. The loneliness, despair, and hatred for men, factors that had festered since her early childhood, now erupted violently, transforming Aileen from a victim into a ruthless perpetrator. After the breakup with Thierry Amour, Aileen Wuornos slid down a steep slope in her life, and the past tragedies transformed into a fire of hatred, igniting a horrific crime spree. The Last Resort Bar in Volusia County became one of the locations marking Aileen's criminal acts. In just 1 year, from late 1989 to late 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered a total of 7 men, shocking public opinion and becoming one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history. The first victim was Richard Mallory, a store owner. On November 30th, 1989, Richard was robbed and shot dead by Wuornos in Clearwater. Around late 1989, Florida police discovered his body. He was a businessman known for his wild lifestyle, with 3 bullet wounds from a .22 caliber gun. This marked the beginning of a series of murders that police initially could not have anticipated. Next was David Spears, a construction worker. Around June 1990, David was shot 6 times by Wuornos, and his body was dumped by the roadside. Initially, he was reported missing on June 1, 1990. Sometime later, his body was found about 64 kilometers north of Tampa. After dental examination, authorities confirmed it was the body of David Spears, a heavy truck mechanic. The subsequent victims were Charles Carskadden and Peter Seams. Charles Carskadden was shot 9 times with a .22 caliber handgun. His disfigured body was found in Pasco County. Notably, Wuornos's fingerprints were found on Peter Seams's abandoned car, but Peter's body was never found. In both cases, the victims were shot dead, with the same .22 caliber handgun, a crucial detail that later helped police connect the cases. The killing spree continued. Troy Burress, a sausage vendor, was shot twice, and his body was dumped in a ditch. Former Air Force Major Charles Humphreys was shot 6 times in the head and body. Wuornos's last victim was Walter Antonio. His bullet-ridden body was found on a deserted road, marking the end of a bloody year during which Aileen Wuornos wreaked havoc on Florida's highways. These cases created a typical Black Widow killer archetype in the media, an exception to the typical profile of female serial killers who usually target financial gain from people they know. For Aileen, the motive was not just money, but also the release of accumulated resentment and anger from a life full of injustice and violence. The horrific series of murders committed by Aileen Wuornos sowed fear along Florida's highways. Local police, led by Colonel Steve Binagar, head of the Marion County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigation Division, quickly realized that these deaths were closely related. The perpetrator was certainly one person using the same .22 caliber handgun. However, fingerprints found in Peter Seams's abandoned car remained a mystery, as they were not in the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, of the police department. Fingerprint expert Jenny Ahern began a painstaking search through all records in Volusia County. After tireless efforts, she finally found the owner of those fingerprints, Lori Grody, a person who had been arrested for gun possession in 1986. The information was immediately sent to Washington, and at the National Crime Information Center, the investigation team learned a crucial truth: Lori Grody was Aileen Wuornos. With this key lead, on January 9, 1991, Volusia County Police quickly arrested Aileen Wuornos. The very next day, Thierry Amour, Aileen's former lover, was also arrested in Pennsylvania, although she was later granted immunity after cooperating with the police. After many days facing intense interrogations from the Criminal Investigation Agency, Aileen Wuornos, in extreme exhaustion, finally officially confessed on January 16, 1991. Aileen's confession unveiled the secret behind the horrific series of murders, paving the way for a historic trial. The trial of Aileen Wuornos officially opened on January 14, 1992, and lasted for 13 days. This was a case that attracted special public attention in the U.S. as a female serial killer was brought to justice. The jury, after 2 hours of tense deliberation, delivered their final verdict. Although psychiatrists testified that Aileen Wuornos suffered from severe mental disorders, the death penalty was still recommended. Months later, Aileen was further convicted of the murders of Dick Humphreys, Troy Burris, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, and Walter Gino Antonio. In each of these cases, Aileen received the death sentence. Aileen Carol Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, in Broward County. This execution made her the 10th female inmate in the U.S. and the second woman in Florida to be executed since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Aileen Wuornos' death not only closed a tragic life, but also left significant questions about the impact of childhood trauma and psychological issues on criminal behavior. Excellent. Let's move on to the final part of this tragic story, the last hours before execution. The last meal, haunting last words, and the legacy left behind. After more than a decade on death row, the fateful day finally arrived for Aileen Carol Wuornos. On the night of October 8, 2002, in a cramped and cold prison cell, Aileen spent her last hours of life. The dim light from the ceiling cast shadows on the gray, damp concrete walls. The heavy clanging of the metal door indicated the presence of the guard. Aileen, now 46, sat on the hard bed, her short hair more gray than in her younger photos. Her eyes were deep-set and tired, yet they retained a defiant, hardened look that had become her trademark. On the small table in front of her was a tray of food, her last meal a medium-rare steak served with French fries, a strong black coffee, and a cold can of Coca-Cola. For dessert, there was a plate of fresh strawberries. Aileen savored each bite slowly, as if trying to prolong every moment, every last taste of life. Early on the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen was led into the execution chamber. The sterile environment and the white light from the fluorescent lamps intensified the grim atmosphere. Aileen walked steadily without a hint of fear, her eyes sweeping over the glass windows where witnesses, including relatives of the victims, stood. She was strapped to the gurney, and a nurse prepared the injection with professional, emotionless movements. A chaplain stood beside Aileen, murmuring final prayers. When the chaplain asked if she had any last words, Aileen turned her head towards the witnesses, her gaze sweeping over each face. Her voice, hoarse but clear, echoed hauntingly through the cold room. "I just want to say I'm sailing with the Lord Jesus Christ. I'll be back. I'll be back like this." She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on an invisible point, and continued, "I'm sorry that I couldn't be better, but you don't know what I've been through. I'm a victim of a rotten system." A faint, cynical smile flickered across her lips, then quickly vanished. She closed her eyes, whispering her final words almost inaudibly. "Freedom, at last." Her body tensed for a moment, then slowly relaxed. Her eyes gradually glazed over, still holding a hint of defiance, a touch of madness, and an immense solitude. Death came swiftly, ending the tragic and criminal life of this notorious serial killer. Aileen Carol Wuornos' legacy is not just the horrific series of murders she committed, but also a case study on the impact of childhood trauma abuse and mental health issues on criminal behavior. Her story was reenacted in the film Monster 2003, starring Charlize Theron, which earned the actress a prestigious Academy Award, once again bringing Aileen's tragic life into the spotlight. Though it ended with a death sentence, the name Aileen Wuornos still resonates, a grim reminder of the dark corners within society and the human psyche. The death sentence has been carried out, closing the case of a brutal murderer. Yet can justice truly be complete when the haunting memories still cling to those left behind? The death of the perpetrator may be an end to their criminal journey, but it opens up a vast emptiness in the minds of the survivors, the victims of the crime, the families shattered by irreplaceable loss. In the darkness, the question of justice still lingers, tormenting. Has every truth been revealed? Are there still hidden corners, secrets yet to be uncovered? The pain and loss will remain gnawing at the souls of the living, reminding them of a past they don't want to remember but can never forget. And it is in these lingering echoes that we realize justice is not just a verdict pronounced, but also the healing of invisible wounds, a relentless journey to find peace for damaged souls.